Hi guys! Today we're going to be talking about Charlotte Perkins Gilman's 1892 story, The Yellow Wallpaper, within the context of the female Gothic. So to remind you, the female Gothic plot, exemplified by someone like Anne Radcliffe in her novel The Mysteries of Udolpho, centralized the imprisoned and pursued heroine threatened by a tyrannical male figure. It explained the supernatural and ended in the closure of marriage. So that's the early high Gothic version of the female Gothic. And we can see already the way this applies to The Yellow Wallpaper. Imprisonment and pursuit are key themes in Perkins Gilman's story, but they're both internalized, in line with the more psychological turn of the American Gothic, which we covered when we read Poe. And because of this internalization, our narrator has trouble recognizing the tyrannical male figure that oppresses her. Instead, she feels entrapped in her own mind and projects her fears onto a female figure within the wallpaper, which is itself emblematic of feminine consumption and domesticity. Yet, though it takes the narrator a long time to blame her husband John for her literal imprisonment in the house, we can see the ways in which the story criticizes wider patriarchal structures, represented by the domestic decor of the wallpaper, which effectively entrap all women. And these are some of the ideas we looked at in Carmilla as well. So Wallace and Smith tell us that the female Gothic is a politically subversive genre, articulating women's dissatisfaction with patriarchal structures and offering a coded expression of their fears of entrapment within the domestic and the female body. And it's that last bit, the female body, that I want to focus on now. Bodies within the Gothic are routinely presented as monstrous when they are othered. So for instance, Frankenstein's monster, described as having yellow skin scarcely covering the work of muscle and arteries beneath, his flowing, lustrous black hair, his glaringly white teeth, his watery eyes, dun white sockets, and straight black lips, all enact sort of racial and class markers within this description. Although the book is never explicit about the monster being of a different race or a different class from Victor, we can see it in the way he is described. This becomes much more explicit, of course, in Wuthering Heights, in the character of Heathcliff, who is explicitly racially othered, described as a dirty, ragged, black-haired child, talking gibberish, so some foreign language, and described as dark, almost as if it came from the devil. Equally, in something like The Telltale Heart, we see the othering of a disabled body. The eye of the old man clearly has the film of cataracts or some other form of blindness, which makes him monstrous to our narrator. I think it was his eye. Yes, it was this. He had the eye of a vulture, a pale blue eye with a film over it. Whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold. In Western culture, the norm or the status quo is embodied in the white male body. Any deviations from this are therefore presented as other, and that is deviations in disabilities, deviations in race, deviations in gender. So the female body is thus always othered, presented as something different and foreign to the male norm. And the female body, particularly in Gothic texts, is often seen to represent both life and death in the form of menstruation. A body that continually bleeds but can grow new life is often rendered grotesque and monstrous. Thus, Marie Mulvey Roberts reminds us that women have been identified primarily through the body, which throughout history has been associated with monstrosity. As a departure from the male, the very notion of the female body has proved troublesome. In Western religious, philosophical, and psychological traditions, the alignment of the female with the monstrous or animal body has helped demote the category of woman in social and political hierarchies. If anyone took the class Making the Modern Human back in second year, you'll remember some of these gendered hierarchies, which in the early modern period, but also throughout the 19th century, suggested that women were closer to nature and closer to animals, with higher faculties and intellectual reason reserved throughout both classical philosophy and Christian theology for man alone, and particularly the white man. In the Victorian period, we can see this way in which the woman is body without mind, or rather, the idea that her body is in some way in tension or in conflict with her mind. So the prominent British psychologist and physician Henry Maudsley asserted this theory in his Objection to Female Education in his 1874 article, Sex in Mind and Education, in which he wrote, carried away by their zeal into an enthusiasm which borders on or reaches fanaticism, proponents of female education seem positively to ignore the fact that there are significant differences between the sexes, arguing in effect as if it were nothing more than an affair of clothes, and to be resolved, in their indignation at women's wrongs, to refuse her the simple rights of her sex. They would do better in the end if they would begin by realizing the facts that the male organization is one and the female organization another, and that, let come what may in the way of assimilation of female and male education and labor, it will not be possible to transform a woman into a man. So Maudsley focuses on the idea that men and women are biologically different and therefore have different capacities. And particularly, his views were based on an idea that the female body was a closed system with limited energy. So therefore, energy directed to one part of the body, such as the brain, would be energy taken away from another part of the body, which for Maudsley was specifically reproductive organs. So this tension between the brain and the body comes to the fore during puberty because of the drain on the body that is menstruation. So Maudsley argues, let it be considered that the period of the real educational strain will commence about that time when, by the development of the sexual system, a great revolution takes place in the body and mind, and an extraordinary expenditure of vital energy is made, and will continue through those years after puberty when, by the establishment of periodical functions, a regularly recurring demand is made upon the resources of a constitution that is going through the final stages of its growth and development. The energy of a human body being a definite and not inexhaustible quantity, can it bear, without injury, an excessive mental drain as well as the natural physical drain which is so great at that time? Or will the profit of the one be to the detriment of the other? So he's focused on this idea that blood loss is a loss of energy, and we can see the ways in which this focus on bleeding makes this rhetoric already quite Gothic. And thus, he thinks the very nature of women's body really renders them inferior to man because they suffer these losses in the form of menstruation, and then pregnancy, and then childbirth, taking things out of their body in a way that men do not. So he says, if she is to be judged by the same standard as men, and to make their aims her aims, we are certainly bound to say that she labors under an inferiority of constitution by a dispensation which there is no gainsaying. This is a matter of physiology, not a matter of sentiment. It is not a mere question of larger or smaller muscles, but of the energy and power of endurance of the nerve force which drives the intellectual and muscular machinery. Not a question of two bodies and minds that are in equal physical conditions, but of one body and mind capable of sustained and regular hard labor, and another body and mind which for 1/4 of each month during the best years of life is more or less sick and unfit for hard work. What's really important here is that a healthy female body, and of course we must remember that regular menstruation is a sign of good health in the female body, is thus equivalent to a sick male body. Healthy female is the same as a sick male, for Maudsley and for many other medical professionals of this period. Women's bodies were therefore pathologized. Even healthy women were seen as diseased. Unhealthy women, those who misdirected their energies, were therefore downright monstrous. Maudsley believed that the lack of energy directed towards the reproductive organs, so energy that's being directed towards the brain rather than the womb, actually shrunk these organs and rendered them useless, resulting in flat-chested women with shriveled wombs. These women, according to Maudsley, were most likely barren, either because of a defective uterus or simply because men would not desire them enough to impregnate them. But if they did reproduce, Maudsley was convinced that they would bear sickly children. If it should so happen that we got the advantages of a quantity of female intellectual work at the price of a puny, enfeebled, and sickly race, in this relation it must be allowed that women do not and cannot stand on the same level as men. We saw some of these anxieties about female reproduction and the mysteries of the female body in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. The mysterious nature of the female reproductive system, which marks women out as barely human for doctors like Maudsley, is evident in the difficulty that Victor has in building a female monster. He has to undertake substantial further study in order to produce the creature's mate. And within that, we might see a dig by Shelley at the scientists and doctors who believed that they understood the human, when in reality they only understood the male body. The womb is a total mystery to Victor. And this idea about energy and where it's being expended is obviously at the heart of the Yellow Wallpaper and the rest cure that our narrator is put under. Her husband, she has recently given birth, she's suffering from postnatal depression, and her husband's trying to redirect energy within her body to the physical body rather than the mind, which is why she's not allowed to read or write. So for Maudsley and for other doctors of the period, women were not just other than men, they were inherently and physiologically inferior to men. They cannot choose but to be women, cannot rebel successfully against the tyranny of their organization, the complete development and function whereof must take place after its kind. This is not the expression of prejudice nor of false sentiment. It is the plain statement of a physiological fact. And the phrasing of this passage brings us back to the female Gothic. We can see here that Maudsley is positioning the woman as the victim of the tyranny not of man, but of her own nature, the tyranny of her own body. She is effectively trapped by her reproductive system, an intelligent mind imprisoned in a body that Maudsley claims is not made for intelligent thought. And Maudsley continues to use Gothicized language in his description of women who try to deny this inherent inferiority or try to escape the tyranny of their bodies. You may hide nature, but you cannot extinguish it. Consequently, it does not seem impossible that, if the attempt to do so be seriously and persistently made, the result may be a monstrosity, something which, having ceased to be woman, is yet not man. A woman who denies her own nature and her natural submissive role becomes a monster in Maudsley's eyes. And this is a monster in both the modern and the classical sense. She is terrible because she is a hybrid. She is trying to be both man and woman at once, and therefore she's just as unnatural a creation as Frankenstein's monster. So, like Frankenstein's monster and like Heathcliff, women are unable to escape their own bodies. They cannot be merely intellectual beings. They are entrapped by their biology as much as the racially other is. And this entrapment is taken further by the subject of Perkins Gilman's story, the rest cure. The rest cure was a medical diagnosis, a medical form of treatment, which usually lasted 6 to 8 weeks. It involved isolation from friends and family and enforced bed rest, with nearly constant feeding on a fatty and milk-based diet. Patients were force-fed if necessary, effectively reducing them to the dependency of an infant. Nurses cleaned and fed them and turned them over in bed. Doctors used massage to maintain muscle tone, and patients were sometimes prohibited from talking, reading, writing, and even sewing. Perkins Gilman underwent the rest cure herself and wrote the yellow wallpaper to warn against the harm she saw it inflicting on women. In her autobiography, The Living of Charlotte Perkins Gilman, published in 1935, Gilman describes her experiences as follows. I was put to bed and kept there. I was fed, bathed, rubbed, and responded with the vigorous body of 26. As far as he could see, there was nothing the matter with me. So, after a month of this agreeable treatment, he sent me home with this prescription. Live as domestic a life as possible. Have your children with you all the time. Lie down an hour after each meal. Have but 2 hours intellectual life a day. And never touch pen, brush, or pencil as long as you live. Anne Stiles therefore tells us about the rest cure pioneered by Silas Weir Mitchell, who treated Perkins Gilman, saying, by putting female patients to bed and forbidding them any sort of intellectual activity, Mitchell and his colleagues ensured that these women stayed in their proper sphere. Mitchell believed that intellectual achievement undermined a woman's overall health, particularly her reproductive function, which we saw in Maudsley's article as well. Thus, he discouraged female patients from seeking professional employment or engaging in prolonged study. The woman's desire to be on a level of competition with man and to assume his duties is, I am sure, making mischief, he wrote in his work, Doctor and Patient. She is physiologically other than man. The rest cure makes a woman nothing but a body. She eats, she sleeps, she is still available for sex with her husband, she feeds her children out of her body, but she does nothing intellectual, nothing with her mind. And thus it enacts one of the central motifs of the female Gothic, that of the woman buried alive. Diana Wallace identifies one of the most powerful metaphors in feminist theory, the idea of woman as dead or buried alive within male power structures which render her ghostly, saying this is, of course, the metaphor which is played out again and again at the heart of female Gothic fiction. And Mulvey Roberts reminds us that the inert female body is an expression of passivity, whose ultimate expression is that of the corpse. And this is the enduring image of the yellow wallpaper, which charts the move from the bedridden woman to the imprisoned figure in the wallpaper, trapped by millennia of patriarchal oppression, who is then strangled to the point of death when she attempts to escape, leaving her dead body paraded along the pattern of the wallpaper as a form of decoration. Sometimes I think there are a great many women behind, and sometimes only one, and she crawls around fast, and her crawling shakes it all over. Then, in the very bright spots, she keeps still, and in the very shady spots, she just takes hold of the bars and shakes them. And she is all the time trying to climb through, but nobody could climb through that pattern. It strangles so. I think that's why it has so many heads. They get through, and then the pattern strangles them off and turns them upside down and makes their eyes white. If those heads were covered or taken off, it would not be half so bad. In the next video, I'll talk about Victorian feminism and the ways in which women tried to combat some of these forms of oppression that they were facing at the end of the 19th century. Thanks for listening, and do email me if you have any questions.